Welcome back to the Total Confidence Podcast. I'm your host, Ahmad Wazir. Got a special treat. One of the top Enneagram teachers of the world. Over the last 3 decades, Russ Hudson has established himself as one of the top teachers and developers of the Enneagram personality typology in the world today. He has been writing and teaching full-time with the Enneagram Institute, as well as on his own since 1991, and has co-authored with Don Richard Riso 5 best-selling books on the subject, including The Wisdom of the Enneagram and Personality Types. These books are widely considered to be not only groundbreaking contributions to the field of Enneagram studies, but are important contributions to the literature and psychological type, and have been translated into French, German, Italian, Spanish, Japanese, Russian, Thai, Chinese, Dutch, Polish, Hungarian, Portuguese, Greek, and Czech editions, with more on the way. They are best-selling Enneagram books in their respective countries. Now, for me personally, when I first was introduced to the Enneagram, my cousin gave me a book called The Enneagram by Helen Palmer. And he said, yeah, man, I'm a 4. And I think you're a 4 too. So I read the 4 part. I said, okay. So then in typical 5 fashion, I went to the library because I ain't had no money and checked out all of these books on the Enneagram. But I picked up this book called The Wisdom of the Enneagram and took a test, a little short test in the beginning. And it said I was a 5. And when I started reading that description, it fit me like a glove. So, man, your work has impacted. I could go on and on about how your work has impacted me personally on this journey, man. So I appreciate having you, man. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much, Amon. It's great to be here with you and get to have a chat. Yeah. And by the way, when I first learned it, I thought I was a 4 too, and then I had to do a little stay. So, oops, nope. I was home base.
Strong 4 wing, I'm sure.
Oh yes.
So how did you come to find the Enneagram, and what was your first impression of it?
Well, that's a little bit of a tricky question in my case, because I originally learned about the Enneagram symbol through the Gurdjieff work. And as people watching this may know, that the Enneagram symbol was brought to the attention of the modern world by George Gurdjieff back at the beginning of the 20th century. So he was bringing it to Russia and places like that before World War I, a long time ago. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't talking about personality types as such. He was just bringing the symbol, and he was talking about methods to wake people up. Mm-hmm. Short. And what does that even mean? Or what does it mean to be asleep? How can we wake up? That was the kind of stuff he was. And as a young man, I was very interested in that subject, because it did seem to me that conscious people would not create the world that we have created. That, right, make some different choices if we were more awake in the sense that Gurdjieff was talking about. So I'm very interested in that. And I started studying the Gurdjieff work here in New York City, which is where I live. I was very lucky that it was here, but I worked with people who, one of my big teachers was a woman named Madame de Salzman, and she had actually lived with Gurdjieff for decades. So, a lot of people yak about Gurdjieff, and sometimes they know something, but a lot of times people just hearsay or make stuff up. And, I was around people who actually lived with them. But they were teaching me about this method. And we weren't talking about 9 types on the Enneagram. That came later. And as you no doubt know, that came through the work of a man named Oscar Ichazo, who lived in South America. And I encountered his work. And at first I couldn't quite understand it. It wasn't really described very much. It just was an Enneagram with these, words around it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But a little bit later, I read the first book written by Don Richard Riso, which was the first major book on the Enneagram typology that came out. There was one that came out by Beesing, O'Leary, and Nagosic, was aimed at very particularly at a Catholic audience, but it and circulated around there. But the first sort of mass market book about it was Don's book. Helen's came out about a year later. And I read that book and I said, this makes a ton of sense. This is really helpful for somebody trying to wake up. This is vital information. And so I guess that's a long journey of saying I discovered different pieces of what we call the Enneagram now over a period of like a decade. It was a long journey. And there weren't a lot of people talking about these things back then. You had to really look. Nowadays, we got podcasts and stuff, which is, I think, good news. You don't have to be looking in the back of independent bookstores to find something, or libraries, as the case may be. Yeah.
So it kind of came piecemeal. That's amazing, because it's almost like the order. Gurdjieff first, and then you go deeper into Ichazo, and then Don Richard.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the Russ Hudson who first discovered that work and the Russ Hudson of today?
Wow, that's a really good question. Well, let's just say I already had in my heart this wish to be more awake, to be of service, to see how I could use whatever talents I have to help out this poor suffering world and do whatever little thing I could do. But I think the Enneagram and seeing that I was a 5 helped me see what the barriers were to that. I think if you're really studying the Enneagram from a good orientation, it helps you see the things you do well that you tend to take for granted. Like, we 5s can figure stuff out. We think, well, sure, anybody can do that. No, not anybody can figure things out the way you and I can do that. 2s might think, oh, sure, everybody just wants to connect and love. No, not everybody does the way you do. And 7s might think everybody could just, go out for the adventure like me. And of course they're going to say yes, but no, we will say no. So we take our gift for granted, but we also don't necessarily see that something we did to protect ourselves is going to block our path to really bringing our gift to the world. So in my case, as a 5, I just was so isolated. And I had friends and stuff, unlike I didn't have friends, I had girlfriends and stuff, but I just didn't let anybody really in. And I think everybody knew that. It was not a newsflash to the people who are around me. But I think the difference now, I learned that for me, if I'm not in contact, if I'm not feeling how I'm affected by life moment by moment, if I'm not feeling and sensing being with you in this conversation now, I'm 3/4 out to lunch. And so I've learned to get a dialogue going between my heart and my mind. That happened through landing in my body, which was about the last place I wanted to be. Where I got into all this, I said, "Oh no, don't take me there."
I can totally relate. So, how did you come about? How did you meet Don Richard Riso, and how did you come to form a relationship where y'all would work together and create this masterpiece, Wisdom of the Enneagram?
Well, thank you. How did I meet Don? It was interesting. As I said, the first book that was out there on this was Don's book, his first book, Personality Types. And I was in the Gurdjieff work. This would have been, I would say, mid-'80s. And his first book, I think, came out in 1987. Yeah, that's right. Helen's book came out in 1988. His book came out in 87. I was in a big bookstore, spiritual bookstore downtown here in New York City called Quest Books. It was a bookstore owned by, I believe, Theosophical Society. And I was just poking around looking for interesting books. And I saw, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water.
Cool.
I saw this book that had an Enneagram on the cover. Now, Enneagram was a symbol of the Gurdjieff work, but personality types, what's this? So I started, looking around in it as you do in a bookstore, seeing if it's worth a purchase. I didn't have a lot of money in those days, so it was a big deal. Okay, I'm going to get this book, and I got that book, and I went home and started reading it. I thought, this is really good. And I just kept it with me for a while, as people do when they find the Enneagram. I was just reading it a lot. So then on the last page of the book, on the back cover, actually, teeny, teeny, tiny little writing at the bottom under this picture of Don, it said Don Richard Riso has a consulting company in New York City called Enneagram Personality Types. Well, let me tell you, this is before cell phones. This is before, we didn't have internet even. And so I called directory assistance, which is what it is.
Yeah.
I called up the operator, said, do you have a number for Enneagram personality types? And she said, yes, we do, and gave me the number. And I called this number, this deep voice answers, and it was Don. And we made an appointment to get together. First, I just said, well, would you like to get together and talk about the Enneagram? He says, I don't do that. I said, but you can have a consultation. I said, okay, I'll have to get a consultation, sure. And there was a long and kind of hilarious story. I was at the time working for a Korean software company. And I was the only guy there that was not Korean. And everybody worked really hard, But I kept asking my boss, I would make an arrangement to meet Don during lunch break. And each time, like 3 times in a row, I went to do that. And he said, no, you can't go you have to stay at the office. I need to do this. So the third time this happened, Don probably thought I was a complete flake. There was no way to tell him. I couldn't tell him. No text, no phone. He just was showing up and I didn't show up. It's like being stood up on a date. So I just, the third time this happened, I just looked at my boss. I said, I'm sorry, sir, but I have to quit. I said, I cannot work under these conditions. I have made my word means something to people, and I've talked to this person 3 times, and 3 times this has happened. I can't work like this. There were other reasons, but that was the breaking point. And so I went there, and I met Don at the American Museum of Natural History next to this giant skeleton of a dinosaur. And because he didn't have an office yet. So we were just really at the beginning. Anyways, I got up there running, and he saw me and he said, I really wondered if you'd come this time. And I said, yep. I said, I just quit my job to meet you. And he goes, really? And I said, yes, really. And I said, so I'll be looking for a new job. So we sat and talked, and we talked about what type I was. And I thought it was a 4. And he said, I'm not so sure you're a 4. I'm not sure what you are, but I don't think you're a 4. So I think you're a thinking type. He had that much. So and then we just, we had a couple more conversations. And then Don started working on his second book, Understanding the Enneagram. And he learned that I was in the Gurdjieff work, which he didn't know about. And he said, tell me more about this Gurdjieff work. I know that it's very important. So I started teaching him about the work and so forth. And at one point I was out looking for other jobs, and he said, why don't you come work with me? And I need an administrative assistant. He said, you know how to organize, you know how to type, you know how to do stuff. So, and we during our breaks and stuff, we can talk about the Enneagram. I said, sure. And he offered flexible hours and everything. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was, I didn't care. I was living simply. I was, I was a musician in those days too. So I figured it would give me time to play my music and so forth. So and then we just started this conversation, and he got more interested in the Gurdjieff work, and he through me, he joined the Gurdjieff work. And then we started thinking, what I noticed, Ahmad, was that a lot of people had sort of taken this piece but they forgot what it was for.
Mm.
And so the whole awakening part, it was just became, which number are you? And that was the beginning, middle, and end of it.
Mm-hmm.
But what
Mm-hmm.
it for my money, it had lost the power of what makes it helpful. What's transformational about this? And so anyway, Don and I started figuring out how to take this enormous body of work he'd done and take what I'd learned from the Gurdjieff work and put this together to do something that would take this growing popularity of the symbol as a typology and put it back in connection with, and this is for you waking up. And that was what led ultimately a few years later to writing Wisdom of the Enneagram. That was what we were trying to do with that book.
So after releasing, because my understanding, you saying that was Personality Types his first book?
Yes.
Okay, Personality Types, and then Understanding the Enneagram.
Right.
So he already was making an impact, even though it wasn't as big as these days, but it still was an audience for it.
He and Helen were the main ones. I mean, there were other teachers, but those were the two big books, the two big schools of thought, you could say.
So after releasing the Wisdom of the Enneagram, describe how it was. Like, what was your thoughts when y'all finished it and sent it out? What were your expectations and actually what transpired immediately after as far as the success of the book?
Well, that was an interesting time. It was a heady time, as we say. We had already worked on some things. We'd worked on discovering your personality type and the test.
Mm-hmm.
And Don asked me to do a revision of personality types based on what we had learned and what we were doing. And so I did that. I revised that book. Mm-hmm. It was a little nerve-wracking to do it. I had to remember, if I make any changes, the original's still there.
Yeah.
How dare I mess with this thing? I thought his first book was so good, but I did see that there were ways we could expand on it. And then we worked on Wisdom of the Enneagram. It was even during some of the other projects. So it was about 7 years working on Wisdom of the Enneagram. But when we were very excited, there was some kind of explosion of interest in the Enneagram in the mid 90s, I'd say. And we had already been working on the book. And then there were a number of authors. I remember Michael Goldberg was the first, who were getting very lucrative offers from publishing companies for books on the Enneagram. And we're thinking, wow, we didn't think anybody even knew about it. But we knew that popularity was growing. More and more people were coming to workshops and stuff. So we worked diligently on it. We worked with a wonderful editor named Tony Burbank, who really helped us and helped us boil it down. And so we went into it. We got some money, which was the first time I'd had any kind of money come my way. And I remember a typical five. I lived in this apartment. I had no furniture. I had a futon on the floor and just a couple old broken chairs. And I said, and Don said, "You better get some furniture." Okay. You got enough books, get some furniture. I got some furniture and stuff. And so we were hoping that this would pay off, because we didn't know how it would go. But we were very happy that people were, as they were reading it, it really touched them, it moved them, they felt understood, like you were saying yourself. Yeah. We worked very hard. When we wrote that book, we said we had 3 rules. One was, it has to be as true as we can make it. We're not just going to repeat hearsay. Mm-hmm. This is true in our experience. Mm-hmm. This is true when we talk with our friend who is that type, whatever. Mm-hmm. 2, it has to be helpful. It has to be something that helps people. There's a ton of stuff I could say about any of the types. Some of it will be helpful. And 3, it has to be in language that people can receive it. Mm. It should not be off-putting jargon. It should be written in a way that people will go, wow, I relate to that. That's me. Yeah, I do that. Oh God, I hadn't even considered that was something wonderful about me. So we wanted people to receive it. And we hoped that would happen. And of course, we were delighted that it did follow. And it was the other thing that happened is I remember, Ahmad, is that book came out in 1999 and it was growing. We were traveling around the world teaching. Then September 11th hit.
Mm.
And then that led to a change too, because Don and his partner Brian moved upstate and established what became the barn, which the Enneagram Institute was built around that barn. And I remained here in New York City. But it just was weird that happened, right after we had the momentum going.
World changed drastically in the middle of that.
Did.
So the Enneagram Institute, talk about that. Like, what led to you deciding, you and Don Richard deciding to establish this? Like, what were the early days like?
Oh, sure. Well, Don was a 4 with a 3 wing and self-pres dominant.
Okay.
He was very private. He, he always was hesitant to go out and engage people. Once he did, he had a nice time. But he always had that little, like, I don't know if I want to, But then he'd go and he'd just be wonderful. Everybody loved him, and he was a lovable guy. But in the early days, he just tried to teach. He kind of knew that if this was going to grow, the book, he needed to go out and do programs and trainings or workshops and teach, but he found it very difficult. So when I came along, at first I was just an assistant, but he saw I had a facility for teaching, which I didn't know. I was, I'd be in front of people, but with a guitar, it's different.
Yeah.
The wood between me and them.
Right.
But he encouraged me to start speaking in the early workshops and trainings that we did together. And we thought, well, we need to have some kind of program that people want to learn about this or get a certificate in the Enneagram. There was almost no place you could do that back then. There was us on the East Coast, and there was Helen Palmer in the narrative tradition out on the West Coast. And we just little by little realized that having some kind of institute, central place where other people could get involved was a good thing. It was always a kind of an interesting tension between Don really wanting to provide people with tools and reach out and include people, and his intense need for privacy and wanting to just do his own thing. So I think under the circumstances of that tension, he did very well. I think we planted a good flag, and basically there were a couple of things. Don and I both, but he and Nick, before I got involved even, was very keen that this be congruent with contemporary psychology, that it not be just some kind of other, belief system, that it should make sense to professionals and psychologists, and that if we were sloppy with language and careless in how we talked about it, it would never get taken seriously. And to some degree, I think Helen agreed with that too. Yeah, she also had that view. She had a different kind of background. The other thing was we wanted to, as I already said, not necessarily have everybody do the Gurdjieff work, which is a big commitment, but to have people understand that it was a tool for awareness, for presence, for compassion. It wasn't just a filing system for human beings. We got plenty of those already. Mostly they're crummy. To have something that used these distinctions about human nature to help us connect more, see each other more accurately, and help this species evolve, so to speak. So that's what we did, and we certified a lot of people over a number of years. We did a lot of trainings and workshops, and we were the first. I think we were the first to have a website in the Enneagram, which was a big deal in the early '90s to have a website.
Absolutely.
long before there were TikTok accounts. You know, just even have a chat room was a big deal. You know, so
Absolutely.
we did that, and we realized too that just good to have a clearinghouse for people to get their questions answered, or to be able to speak more with more assuredness and authority about what this topic actually is. So, you know, we also, it was the other thing I'll say about the Institute, we always were trying to find a balance. Don and I both had our own spiritual and religious beliefs. You know, Don was a Jesuit, as I think many people know. He never got ordained, but he left right before he would have been ordained. But he was in Jesuit seminary for many, many years. And he had that background. And I come from a different background, more coming out of this fourth way tradition. And we wanted to have this be secular and available to people who didn't necessarily have any particular religious angle, spiritual angle as such. But we also wanted it to be obvious to people who did have a spiritual background that this was actually for that. So that was a interesting kind of constant balance in how we used our language and everything to tell everybody, look, if you're on a spiritual path, this is really going to help you. And if you're not on a spiritual path, or you don't think of yourself that way, it will still help you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can see that. How has the Enneagram in those days, you know, being received, especially when you mentioned like the world of psychology, and I would go even more academia in general. How was it received then compared to how it's received now?
Well, you know, it's always been a little tricky with, certainly with academic psychology. So I can make a distinction here. I think early on, a lot of psychotherapists saw this was really powerful and helpful. So even in the early days when Don and I were teaching workshops and trainings, a lot of the people who came to learn from us were psychotherapists. It was a bit before the whole career of coaching took off like it has. I mean, there weren't so many people who called themselves coaches back then, but there were a lot of psychotherapists. So people in the trenches who were really out there helping people got right away that this was super helpful for them working with their clients. Sometimes they would tell them about the Enneagram. Sometimes they didn't. They just used it for insight into what was going on with their client. So that was the thing. But academic psychology is always, academics in general has to have a kind of conservative bent. You have to kind of really prove it. It has to be established. It has to connect with other things in academia. So, you know, there was a lot of resistance, but I think that's changed. The fact that Helen's teaching partner with Dr. David Daniels was a professor of psychiatry in Stanford. And, you know, Don went to Stanford. I went to Columbia. We were not exactly, you know, unaware of the academic world. Let's put it that way. Little by little, we built credibility for it. And there were studies that we did in the early noughts or mid noughts, actually, where we were trying to see if there was if we could prove statistically there was something to the Enneagram itself. Not proving a test. How can you prove a test of something they haven't proved the existence of yet?
Right.
So I'm always suggesting to people when they're espousing these extraordinary numbers on their Enneagram tests, the accuracy, first off, you know, academic psychologists will tell you those numbers aren't possible. Second of all, if you're measuring something that hasn't been measured, we're on shaky ground in terms of academic psychology. So, you know, there was a process of just getting it down to those kind of basics. How could we measure this? How could we get academic psychologists to look at this? It's been a gradual process. Some people have looked at it in relation to neuroscience and things like that. It's a long process, but I think it's come a long way. I think the academics and psychologists who have looked at it have been amazed and kind of delighted and to discover that it holds up pretty well. You know, we're not just the nice thing is what Don and I used to say. The nice thing about the Enneagram, it doesn't require belief. If I'm describing a type to an academic psychologist, and all of a sudden they're grinning ear to ear because I described their mother or their wife or their husband or whatever, you know, they're just like, okay, you got me. You know, and people, it's kind of self-evident. But the other thing is, I think when people actually work with it and get benefit, that's the proof in the pudding too. But you know, we're getting there with the psychology, and it has come a long way since we first were looking at it. But it's good to remember, even Claudio Naranjo, who was one of the earliest proponents, who learned it from Naranjo and was first one out there. He was the one who developed panels. He started doing panels to show people that there was something to this. But he was a psychiatrist. He's a Berkeley trained psychologist. So that there were always people with a good scientific and psychological background who were involved in the development of this.
It's funny, I almost read my mind. I was thinking about Claudio Naranjo and just what does he mean to, what has he meant and what does he mean to this work, especially today?
Yeah, I think if you think about the field of the psychological typing, the part of the Enneagram that most people are familiar with, you have to give a lot of credit to Oscar Ichazo, and you have to give some credit to Claudio Naranjo. Now, Oscar's thing was more esoteric. You know, I really wanted to have a conversation with him, and he actually welcomed it. He says, if Russ wants to come talk with me, you know, but you know, schedules and life and death never happened. So he passed away a few years ago, but he was looking at various maps of consciousness from the spiritual traditions, and he had been in a Gurdjieff group and learned the Enneagram, the Gurdjieffian way of it was a way of looking at things, a way of looking at phenomena, opening up another level of understanding, and he used it that way. And it led him to this understanding of the fixations and the passions and the things that the whole Enneagram is based on. He did 108 Enneagons. That's a Buddhist number. But the whole Enneagram movement is based on, you know, 4, maybe 6 of them. But he made them about all kind of phenomena and so forth. So he was just studying it on that level. Claudio, who was, you know, a psychiatrist, started relating those fixations and type patterns that he learned from Ichazo with psychiatric categories. So he started looking at how is Enneagram 1 related to what in the DSM and psychiatry we'd call obsessive compulsive personality, right? So he was doing those kind of correlations and made it more specifically about psychological type. That was not really what Oscar was focused on. Oscar was looking at it more in the original sense. If you go back to where Oscar got the passions, he got them from the desert fathers and mothers of Egypt. They were looking at these as vexations, as distractions from prayer and meditation. Like, what takes your attention out of the moment? Because if you're here in the moment, you're in the presence of God. That's traditional view in all 3 of the what Judaism, Christianity, Islam all have that there's only one presence, and that's what I'm trying to get in touch with, right? When I'm teaching in the Middle East, that's what I'm talking about, right? So he was looking at it like that, but Claudio was looking at it from the view of psychiatric categories and tilted it more toward psychological type. And that's what, you know, Don and Helen and others picked up from. Helen attended some of his talks in Berkeley, and Don certainly was aware. By the time the information got to Don, he had Oscar's fixes his stuff, but he also was aware of notes that had been taken on Claudio's stuff. I think Claudio would, we certainly would not have the Enneagram field we have without Claudio. He was very important. That being said, it's sort of like Freud or Jung. They were very important in establishing significant schools of thought about all of it, but they weren't right about everything. And how could they be? So I'm somebody who has tremendous love and respect for Claudio. He and I were friends. I hung out with him on a number of occasions. But also, we both, as fives, knew that sometimes we were wrong. And we weren't attached to it, Claudio wasn't attached to it. And so there were some of the things that he taught that were not, in my view, precise. He was onto something, but he didn't quite nail it. And some of that was simply because Claudio was never in the Gurdjieff work. He was never in the school of thought behind this, although he was tremendously brilliant and learned from a variety of sources. There were certain, what do I want to say, core transmission to this teaching, which he was not subject to. So he was like Don Richard. When Don Richard started, he was brilliant and just piecing together the best he could and made enormous contributions. But there was, I just say, I don't take any of these guys, including Gurdjieff, as flawless, as having all the answers. They each saw something important about human nature. They each contributed something really significant about the teaching, and we should learn from them, but don't turn it into the 10 Commandments.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's important, especially for me as a social five. We like our totems. We like our
we like our structures. We like our maps. Yes.
Yeah. What do you find to be the biggest challenge of teaching today? With this, as opposed to in the original days.
Well, it's sort of the fact that it's spreading in different directions, the teaching. And so I think the big challenge is nowadays, I'll just speak for myself, but I think others will relate. How do I stay true and pure around the purpose and intention of this while being more skillful at communicating it to people in different walks of life, different communities, different cultures? I've been very lucky. I've taught this all over the planet. I've taught on every single continent except Antarctica. And I've taught people of very diverse cultures, and it lands for people everywhere. And it takes a certain sensitivity and intelligence, which hopefully you've gained some from doing the work on yourself.
Right.
You meet people where they are and invite them into the conversation. So that's the one side of it. How do we get more skillful at helping people embrace this within the context of their social milieu, their community? And at the same time, how do we do that without selling it out, making it about something it's not? I mean, I can make it really safe for people in organizations, and it will then become absolutely useless. So how do I keep the cutting edge of it, the diamond precision of it, at the same time as I'm communicating it in a way that people can kind of lean and go, oh yeah, that makes sense. So you can take that in a lot of different directions, and it requires another level of learning on both of those fronts. But I think that's the challenge of our time. When on one day I'm talking to, Silicon Valley executives, another day I'm talking to nuns, another day I'm talking to school kids in Africa, another day I'm talking to just people who off the street in Korea. So it's just, but I think the Enneagram at its core is an invitation to come home to our truest humanity. And in that, we meet each other. With all of our beautiful little quirks, cultural nuances, we meet each other and where we're true to who we are and we meet.
Beautiful. As we bring this to a conclusion, because I'll be respectful of your time. I know you have another commitment, man. So I thank you. What is your, or maybe it's more than one, but like your proudest moment of teaching? Like, is there something that comes to mind where it's just like, this is, the height of why I'm doing this work?
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple things come to mind. Well, just on day to day, I get notes and letters from people who it helped them not take their own life, for example.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
things like that, like a wow, wow, you put things out and you don't know how they're going to land, but that goes back to those three things Don and I want to do. So that's some sign that we reached at least some people that way. I remember teaching in Bangladesh many years ago, and we were helping a group of very diverse people working for UNICEF, for United Nations for kids. And they were Buddhists and they were Muslims and they were Hindus and they were from Nepal and India and Pakistan and Myanmar and Bangladesh, of course. And they were having all these cultural resistances to each other. So we used the Enneagram to help them see their brother and sisterhood, to help them find a better way to work together. Like you might be a Muslim and I might be a Buddhist, but we're both sixes. Wow. And you do that too. Oh my God. I had no idea. And so that was a high point. The other thing that comes to mind is I've been supporting and helping something called the Enneagram Prison Project that my colleague and friend Susan Olesic created a number of years ago. And Don and I and David Daniels and a few other teachers really helped her get this off the ground. But sitting there in jails or prisons where there's not a lot of wiggle room for BS.
yeah, yeah,
These men and women, they've seen it all. They've been through hell and back, and in some cases, a miracle that they're alive. But to just sit with them and for them to feel seen, validated, recognized, to receive their tears, uh,
mm,
to hold them in that humanity. That's some of the times I felt most like this is why we have this tool and this is why I'm doing this work. To just reach down into hell sometimes and
mm,
help people be out. And I just say one other thing about that, Ahmad. I think sometimes people get into this work because they have been in hell themselves.
mm.
I certainly was, without getting into the details of my story. Um, and I think I just say to people, don't be discouraged. That is the thing that you found a path is exactly the gift you're going to bring to others.
Mm.
People will believe you because you've been there. You know what it's like. And so that's the thing, when you're sitting with people, we are not present because we've got so much undigested suffering.
Mm.
And we're helping each other to digest that suffering together little bit by little bit so that we don't have to keep checking out and alienating each other. So
Beautiful,
whenever I see that happening, I'm a happy guy.
beautiful. And in conclusion, Russ, what would be your words of wisdom to current and future Enneagram teachers? And what would you like to see as far as where the Enneagram is going from here?
I think one of the beautiful things about the internet is you can learn a lot of things really fast. You can just go bing, bing, bing and get information. You get your Wikipedia article, you can get whatever, and it's pretty quick, but doesn't mean you understand.
Mm.
And I think we live in a time where the value of apprenticeship, of taking your time, of really learning the craft of it is everybody's just racing out to market. I've been to 2 workshops and seen a couple of podcasts. I'm putting out my shingle. I'm an Enneagram master. Well,
Yeah.
maybe not. Maybe not.
Yeah.
So I think some humility
Mm.
about what we can lift and what we can do, um, even under the enormous pressure of commerce, which is always here.
Yeah.
Some humility. Don Richard when I first started working with him, I went to my Gurdjieff teacher and I said, I don't know if I can do this. I don't feel, in the Gurdjieff work, you were in it like a decade before they even can begin to consider you teaching something.
Wow.
Same with Almas's school, the Ridwan Diamond Approach. Nobody becomes, you join a Sufi school, you join a Kabbalistic school, you become a Christian monk or something. You're not going to become the master
instantly.
Please. So I had no ambition. And so Don said, I think you can do it. And my teacher said to me, based in my doubt, he said, if you drop in and teach from your experience, authentically from your experience, don't talk about things you don't know about. But from your experience, he said, it will always be compelling to people and it will do more benefit for them than you will be able to know. So, so that means two things. One, yes, present and do it that way. Don't promise the moon. The Enneagram is really cool, but it can't answer everything.
Yeah.
And three, apprentice, learn from people, keep going. Don't rest on your laurels, as they say. Studying. And studying is both learning the material, but it's also developing your own capacity. Work with the Enneagram. If you have been a type and you see how your personality leads you to do things, and you learn that little trick of not giving yourself to that, that's the goal. That's what people want to learn. So the more you just keep growing your own capacity to see yourself, to observe yourself, and to refrain from behaviors that take you down, you're going to be able to share that with others. And that would be one thing. And yeah, teachers, and the last thing I say, teachers, there are wonderful people who all have something that they can teach you. Never turn them into a parent, never turn them into an idol. They will disappoint you. They are humans. And so learn from them what you can, and think of them more like older brothers and sisters. You're going out on a hot date and you could use some tips. It's more like that.
That is beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you. Thank you for making time for me, man. I look forward to meeting you in San Francisco.
Yeah, you're going to be there?
I'm going to be there, God willing.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Inshallah.
Inshallah. That's right. That's right. So this is Totem Confidence Podcast. Man, it's been a treat and an honor to talk with Russ Hudson. And thank you and be safe.
Thank you.
Next time.